There is a particular kind of revenge that never raises its voice, the kind built in silence, filed in triplicate, and delivered by someone else's handcuffs. What makes this story worth examining is the weapon the protagonist chose, a forensic accounting trail laid down months before she was ever shown the door. Welcome to Historical Manhwa.
The first thing Naomi Che noticed when she walked into Hargrove Capital Management on the morning of March 14th was the smell. Burnt coffee. Not the rich, slightly acidic smell of the first pot of the day, but the scorched, almost caramelized smell of a carafe that had been sitting on a heating element for at least 3 hours. Someone had forgotten to turn the machine off. The kitchen was empty. That small, neglected detail bothered her in a way she could not immediately explain. She had spent 8 years training the staff of the 24th floor to maintain standards. That coffee pot was supposed to be emptied, rinsed, and refilled by 8:15 a.m. at the latest. She checked her watch. It was 9:03. She set her bag down on the counter, turned off the burner herself, and looked at the burnt residue at the bottom of the glass carafe. Brown, black, almost like tar. She thought about rinsing it, then decided against it. She had a 9:30 with the board. She had a presentation, 47 slides she had built over the last 6 weeks. That would outline HCM's Q2 forecast, the corrected variance analysis she had been pushing for since January, and 3 strategic acquisition targets she had identified in the secondary private equity market. Naomi was thorough. She had been thorough for 8 years, and thoroughness had made her vice president of finance at 34, which was the kind of statistic that got her mentioned in 2 industry publications and quoted once in a Forbes piece about women in alternative investment management. She walked to her office, set down her laptop bag, and pulled up her slides one more time. Why, the thing people misunderstood about Naomi Che was that she was not a warm person. She was not cold in the dramatic sense. She did not deliver cutting remarks or maintain a carefully curated air of menace. She was simply precise. She spoke when she had something accurate to say. She listened when the information was useful. She had learned over the course of her career that the people who spent the most energy performing a motion in the boardroom were usually the people who had the least substance to offer once the performance ended. She did not perform, she delivered. At 9:22, her assistant, a young man named Derek, who had been with her for 2 years, knocked twice and opened her door slightly without crossing the threshold. "Ms. Che." He paused. Naomi looked up. Derek was holding a tablet with both hands, which he only did when he was carrying a message he did not want to deliver verbally. She had learned to read this particular gesture the way a doctor learns to read a patient's posture before a diagnosis. "Mr. Hargrove asked me to let you know the 9:30 has been rescheduled." "Rescheduled to when?" It's not rescheduled to a specific time. He said he'd like to meet with you separately at 10:15 in his office." Naomi looked at Derek for exactly 2 seconds. "The board meeting is still on the calendar at 9:30? "Yes, as far as I know." She looked back at her screen. "Thank you, Derek." He hesitated. She could see it in the way his weight shifted in her peripheral vision. She did not look up again. After a moment, he retreated and pulled the door closed with the careful click of someone trying not to make noise. Naomi sat very still. The board meeting was still on the calendar. She had been removed from it. She had not been removed from a board meeting at Hargrove Capital Management in 4 years. The last time it had happened, it was because she was presenting her father's eulogy in Seoul and had arranged the removal herself, a week in advance, with a detailed briefing document left for Marcus and a full set of annotated slides. She controlled her own schedule with the same precision she applied to the company's quarterly variance reports. A last-minute exclusion from a meeting she had prepared for, a meeting for which she had delivered a 47-slide deck to Marcus's inbox at 11:30 p.m. the previous Thursday, was not an administrative oversight. She opened a new browser tab and navigated to the company's internal portal. She checked the 9:30 board meeting entry. As the attendees list had been updated, her name was gone. In its place, she found a name she did not recognize. S. Whitfield. She read it twice. She closed the tab. She took a measured breath, the kind that expanded her ribcage and held for 3 counts, which she had learned in a stress management course she'd taken 6 years ago, and never mentioned to anyone because she found it embarrassing that she'd needed it. The technique had nothing to do with relaxation. It was about creating a 3-second window between stimulus and response. Enough time to prevent the face from doing something the brain would regret. 3 seconds. She opened a new document and began to type. She typed 2 words, S. Whitfield. Then she sat back and thought about what she already knew. She had been at this company for 8 years. Yet she had been VP of Finance for 3. In the 3 years she had held that title, she had restructured the internal reporting process, identified and closed a $2.3 million discrepancy in the infrastructure fund accounts, expanded the analytics team from 2 to 7, and personally managed the integration of Hargrove Capital's acquisition of a mid-sized Portland-based hedge fund, a process that had taken 14 months and had been described by the acquiring board as the smoothest deal integration we've seen in a decade. She had not taken a vacation longer than 4 days in 3 years. She had not taken a sick day in 18 months. She had also, in the last 11 weeks, been quietly and methodically building a file. She did not call it that. She did not call it anything. Oh, she kept it in a personal drive account. Not the company's system, not her work laptop, but a clean personal device she had purchased with cash from an electronics store near her apartment, paid in full, no warranty registration. She used it exclusively at home, on her personal internet connection. The folder containing the file had a name that meant nothing. Renovation Notes. Inside it were 6 subfolders and 41 documents. Some were screenshots, some were exports she had made in the ordinary course of her work and then saved to the personal device before deleting them from her work machine. Some were notes, dates, times, figures, names, typed in plain text, no formatting, nothing that could be described as dramatic. She had not yet decided what to do with any of it. She had been deciding for 11 weeks. At 10:14, she picked up her jacket from the back of her chair, straightened it, and walked down the hall to Marcus Hargrove's office. Marcus Hargrove was 61 years old and had the particular kind of confidence that comes not from accomplishment, but from inheritance. His father had started the firm. Marcus had expanded it, competently, in the way that men expand things when they are given a strong foundation and a cooperative economy. He was not stupid. He was, however, the kind of man who confused the absence of obvious error with excellence, who believed that because the company had not collapsed on his watch, he must be doing something right. He wore his suits a size too large across the shoulders. He had a photograph on his desk of himself shaking hands with a former Treasury Secretary, and he had mentioned it, in Naomi's presence, as 17 times in 8 years. She had counted without meaning to. She knocked. He called her in. The first thing she noticed was that the chair across from his desk, the one where she always sat, was already occupied. She stopped walking. The woman in the chair turned. She was younger than Naomi, perhaps 28, possibly 30, with the kind of deliberate aesthetic that communicated money without specifying where the money had come from. Her hair was the color of pale wheat, blown straight in a way that took effort. Her blazer was a warm cognac color that read as expensive. She had the steady, pleasant expression of someone who had rehearsed it. Naomi? Marcus stood partially, the way he did when he wanted to perform courtesy without committing to it. I'm glad you could make time. Please sit. There was a second chair, slightly further from the desk than hers. She sat in it. This is Sloan Whitfield, Marcus said. Sloan joins us from Meridian Partners. I wanted you two to meet before I make the formal announcement to the team. Naomi looked at Sloan Whitfield. Sloan Whitfield looked back at Naomi with the measured, pleasant expression of someone who already knew exactly what this meeting was. The announcement, Naomi said. Marcus folded his hands on his desk. He did this when he was delivering news he had already rehearsed. She had seen it before, at the termination of a senior analyst 3 years ago, at the restructuring announcement the year after that. The folded hands were a signal. This is decided. I am simply narrating it. We've been looking at the finance division for some time, he said, thinking about structure. I was thinking about where we want to be going into the next cycle. We believe the VP role needs a different skill set for this next phase. Sloan brings a background in. You're replacing me, Naomi said. Not a question. Not particularly loud, just the accurate sentence. Marcus unfolded his hands and refolded them the other way. We're restructuring the role. You'll receive a generous... What is the transition structure? He blinked. I'm sorry? What is the transition structure? How long do I stay on in an advisory capacity? What does the handover period look like? What are the exit terms? Sloane Whitfield had very slightly adjusted her posture, a small lean forward, observing. Marcus looked briefly at a paper on his desk, a paper Naomi had not noticed before. He had prepared notes. Of course he had. Well, someone had told him she would ask precise questions, or else he had learned it himself over 8 years. We'd like 30 days, he said. Full salary, full benefits. There's a severance package, 4 months, as part of the separation agreement. We'd ask that you agree to a standard non-disclosure and non-compete before signing. 4 months, 8 years of work, and the arithmetic of her departure was 4 months. I'll need the agreement in writing before the end of business today, she said. I'll have my attorney review it by Friday. Something moved in Marcus's face. A flicker of surprise, maybe resentment quickly neutralized. He had expected something else. Emotion, perhaps? Pushback? Questions about why? She had given him none of those things, because she had no use for them. Of course, he said. She stood. She looked at Sloane Whitfield one more time. A full, unhurried look, the kind that takes in information rather than projects it. Sloane looked back. Still pleasant, still rehearsed, but there was something underneath the rehearsal, a quality Naomi recognized the way a chemist recognizes a particular compound by its reaction to heat. Sloane was not afraid of her. That was information. She walked back to her office. She sat down. She opened her laptop and sent a single text from her personal phone to a contact she had saved under a name that would mean nothing to anyone reading her messages. Call me at noon. The contact's name was Martin Yee. He was a financial forensics consultant who had spent 12 years at the Securities and Exchange Commission before going into private practice. He was not her attorney. He was not her friend. He was a man she had met at a conference in 2021 and kept in her network the way she kept every useful contact, with care, without sentiment, in a mental file she had labeled Future. She had called him 3 times in the last 11 weeks. This would be the 4th. She spent the next 40 minutes reading the separation agreement that Marcus's assistant delivered to her inbox at 10:58 a.m. She made no marks on it. She simply read it, the way she read every document, sequentially, without skipping, looking for the language that was doing the most structural work. She found it in Section 4, subsection B, the non-disparagement clause. It was broader than standard. It covered not just public statements, but communications with current or former clients, employees, vendors, or partners of Hargrove Capital Management and its affiliated entities. It was written, in other words, to prevent her from talking to anyone who had ever touched the company. She sat with that for a moment. Then she pulled up the internal calendar and looked at the next 4 weeks. The Q2 audit review was scheduled for week 5 of the next month. The external auditors, a firm called Greenberg Nacht, with whom she had worked for 6 years, were due on site on April 18th. She knew every partner at that firm. She knew the senior associate who led the HCM engagement specifically, a methodical woman named Rita Blom. And she knew Rita's process. Preliminary review request sent 3 weeks in advance, initial documentation pull in the first week on site, variance questions submitted in writing to the finance team. Now, Naomi did not sign the separation agreement that day. She had 30 days. She intended to use them. The next morning, she was in early. The coffee pot was full and fresh. Someone had remembered. She noted it without comment. She moved through her day the way she always had, precisely, quietly, doing her job. She reviewed 3 fund performance reports. She approved 2 expense reconciliations. She sat in on a portfolio meeting and offered 2 specific accurate observations about exposure in a secondary market position that 2 of the senior analysts wrote down. She said nothing about the previous day's meeting. She did not behave differently than she had on any other Tuesday for 8 years. At 4:30, she sat at her desk and opened the document she had been building since January. Let me tell you about the document. Well, it had started not with suspicion, but with arithmetic. In January, Naomi had been reviewing the year-end fund disbursement records, a routine task she performed personally because she did not trust routine to remain accurate without supervision. The task involved reconciling disbursement figures from 3 feeder funds against the master fund allocation schedule. It was the kind of work that required patience and a specific tolerance for the boredom of looking at numbers that were nearly correct. Nearly correct was the key phrase. Nearly correct in finance was not correct. It was the shadow version of correct, and shadows meant a source. She had found a $40,000 discrepancy in the disbursements from a fund she was calling in her notes Fund Stasi, the Cortland Infrastructure Feeder Fund. The $40,000 had moved through a legitimate vendor account, coded correctly, documented with an invoice she found on file. The invoice was from a company called Brixton Advisory Group, which was listed in the system as a compliance consulting firm. The vendor had been added to the system 18 months prior. Naomi had pulled Brixton Advisory Group's registration, a Delaware LLC, registered in July 2 years ago. Single listed manager, no web presence, no office address beyond the registered agent's address in Wilmington. The phone number on the invoice rang twice and went to a generic voicemail. She had not left a message. She had requested the contract. The contract for Brixton Advisory Group, a one-page document that described services in language so vague as to be legally meaningless, had been signed by Marcus Hargrove, not the COO. Not the legal department, not the CFO, a title that she technically occupied beneath the VP designation. Marcus had signed it personally outside the normal procurement process, which required dual authorization for any vendor contract over $15,000. She had noted this, filed it, kept looking. By February, she had found 3 more vendors with similar profiles. Sparse registration, vague service descriptions, no traceable business presence, all contracted directly by Marcus's signature. The total across all 4 vendors for the prior 18 months was $347,000. $347,000. Not a number so large it would have triggered immediate regulatory scrutiny in a fund of HCM's size. Not a number so small it was invisible. A number that had been parceled deliberately, she believed, what's into amounts and categories designed to sit just below the thresholds that would draw automated attention during a standard audit review. She had been thinking about this for 11 weeks. She had said nothing. Not because she was afraid, and not because she was uncertain about what she had found. She had said nothing because she was not finished building the case, and she had learned early in her career that a case that is presented before it is complete does not change minds. It creates warnings. It gives the people who need to be cornered time to run. Now she had something she had not had 11 weeks ago. She had a deadline, 30 days. And within those 30 days, she had access to every system, every document she needed. Because she was still P of Finance. The separation agreement was unsigned, technically, legally. She was still in her role. She spent the next 3 weeks working, not dramatically, not in the way of someone who is gathering evidence in a movie, no furtive glances, no late-night office break-ins, no encrypted USB drives changing hands. She worked the way she had always worked, systematically within her legitimate authority, using tools she had a professional right to use. She requested vendor documentation through the normal procurement portal. She reviewed fund allocation records as part of her ordinary end-of-quarter process. She cross-referenced disbursement records against fund performance reports the same way she had done for 3 years. And every day, at the end of the workday, on the clean personal device in her bag, she made a copy, not of proprietary client data, and not of anything that crossed the line from documentation to misappropriation. She was careful about that. Precise. The way she was precise about everything. She copied transaction records that were relevant to the 4 vendor accounts. She copied the correspondence between Marcus and the procurement team that related to those vendors. She copied the vendor contract documents. She built a timeline in plain text. She also called Martin Yee. Their second week call lasted 47 minutes. She walked him through what she had found. Martin was a man who had spent 12 years reading financial crime, which meant he had a particular quality. He did not perform surprise. He listened the way a radiologist looks at an image, quietly, systematically, without comment until he had seen enough. The key question, he said, is whether the fund disbursements benefit the parties you think they benefit. You need a beneficial ownership trace on those LLCs. I ran Delaware and Wyoming, she said. Both states allow anonymous LLCs. I can't get to the actual beneficiaries through the state registrations. FinCEN Beneficial Ownership Database, Martin said. As of 2024, beneficial ownership disclosures are required for all domestic LLCs under the Corporate Transparency Act. If these companies are real, they've filed. If they haven't filed, that's its own problem. Either way, your forensic accountant can subpoena that data. I don't have a forensic accountant, not yet. You will. Get the documentation as far as it goes. I'll connect you with someone. The call ended. Naomi sat at her kitchen table with her coffee. Real coffee, not the office carafe. Is a single-origin Ethiopian she brewed in a Chemex that she had bought herself as a $40 rebellion against the concept of convenience. And she thought about the separation agreement sitting unsigned on her personal printer. She thought about the non-disparagement clause. She thought about the word disparagement. She had looked it up, academically, not because she didn't know the definition, but because she wanted to be precise about what the clause actually prohibited. Disparagement, in this context, meant statements made with the intent to harm reputation or economic interest. It did not mean, legally, structurally, it could not mean a disclosure of documented financial crimes made to a regulatory body. The law was clear on this. Whistleblower protections under Dodd-Frank Section 922 were unambiguous. Retaliation against a person who reports a potential securities law violation to the SEC was prohibited regardless of any contract the person had signed. And more specifically, according to a 2015 SEC rule clarification, any contractual provision that attempted to impede a person from communicating with the SEC was itself a potential violation. She had read the SEC's interpretation document 3 times. She could have recited the relevant sections from memory. The non-disparagement clause in the separation agreement could not touch her. Not if she reported to the commission, not if she did it correctly. She had one remaining question: timing. Her 30-day advisory period ended on April 14th. Most the external auditors from Greenberg Nacht were on site starting April 18th. The question was whether to report to the SEC before or after the audit, and whether to make contact with Rita Blum at Greenberg Nacht directly. Martin had given her an opinion on this. SEC first, he had said on their 3rd call. Always. You file the tip. You do it through the online portal, tip, complaint, referral form, the TCR. You document the date of filing. Then you are officially and legally a whistleblower under Dodd-Frank. Once that status is established, every subsequent action you take, including talking to the auditors, is protected. You do it the other way, you're just a disgruntled ex-employee with a grudge and a folder full of documents. I understand the sequence, she said. I know you do. I'm saying it, so you hear it out loud. The other variable was Sloan Whitfield. Naomi had spent the past 3 weeks observing her replacement with the same systematic attention she applied to everything else. What she had observed was interesting. Sloan Whitfield was not incompetent. That would have been simpler, and simplicity was rarely the dominant feature of situations that mattered. Sloan was, in fact, technically capable in the narrow sense. She could read a fund performance report, she understood basic allocation mechanics, she knew the language. What Sloan was not was careful. She was a person who moved quickly, who relied on confidence and on the assumption that the systems she was entering had been built for her convenience. She asked few questions and answered many of them before fully reading the thing she was being asked about. She made decisions with the comfortable speed of someone who had not yet been wrong about anything large enough to leave a mark. On her first day, which was day 18 of Naomi's transition period, Sloan had requested administrative access to the fund management system. Standard access would have taken the normal credentialing process, a request to IT, a review by the compliance officer, a 2-week provisioning period. Sloan had bypassed this by going directly to Marcus, who had instructed IT to provision full administrative access immediately. Naomi had been in the room when Derek mentioned this to her, reading it off a system notification she received as the outgoing VP. She had said nothing. She had noted it. On Sloan's 3rd day, she had requested the full vendor contract archive. the same archive where Naomi had found the 4 ghost vendors, and had not flagged a single anomaly. Either she had not looked carefully, or she had looked and understood what she was seeing and had chosen not to flag it. Naomi considered both possibilities without preference. The truth would become clear through the documentation. What she had not anticipated was what happened on Sloane's 9th day. She found out about it not through observation, but through the financial system alert she still received. Again, because the access removal for her old accounts had been delayed, a bureaucratic gap that would have embarrassed the IT team if anyone had been paying attention. A new vendor had been added to the system. The vendor was called Whitfield Consultants, LLC. Naomi sat very still when she read that. She pulled the vendor profile. Delaware LLC registered 4 months ago. Service category, strategic advisory. Contract value, $85,000 for the current fiscal quarter. Signed by Sloane Whitfield. She had signed her own consulting company into the fund management system. She had authorized a payment to herself, structured as an advisory contract, within her first 2 weeks of employment. This was not subtle embezzlement. This was the kind of move that spoke to a particular kind of confidence. The kind born from having done it before without consequence, or from having been told explicitly that it was acceptable. Whether Sloane had been running a version of this scheme at Meridian Partners, or whether Marcus had given her permission to set up a revenue stream as part of their arrangement, Naomi could not yet determine. Both possibilities were worth documenting. Either way, the move was either enormously stupid or enormously arrogant. And in her experience, those 2 qualities occupied the same zip code. She added it to the folder. On day 22 of her transition period, she submitted the TCR form to the SEC. She sat at her kitchen table at 10:40 p.m. and completed the form on the agency's online submission portal. She had drafted it over the course of a week, not because it was difficult to write, but because it needed to be exactly right. It needed to be specific. It needed to cite the correct regulatory provisions. It needed to describe the conduct clearly, without using language that overstated what she could prove versus what she had documented. She had had Martin review the draft twice. The form described, with specificity and documentation references, the following: potential violations of Section 206 of the Investment Advisors Act of 1940, fraud by investment advisors, specifically the diversion of fund assets to undisclosed related party accounts through a series of contracts with entities bearing hallmarks of shell companies. Potential violations of Section 17A of the Securities Act of 1933 and Section 10, B of the Securities Exchange Act of 1934 in connection with the misrepresentation of fund expenses in investor reports. A recently identified potential violation by a newly appointed VP of Finance. Else involving a vendor self-dealing arrangement that may constitute breach of fiduciary duty and securities fraud. She attached a compressed file containing 41 documents. She clicked submit at 11:07 p.m. The confirmation number appeared on her screen. She took a photograph of it with her phone. She emailed herself a copy. She printed a copy on her personal printer. She put the printout in a folder, which she put in a fireproof document case she kept in the back of her closet between a box of tax returns and a spare set of apartment keys. Then she washed her face, made a second cup of coffee, and went to bed. She slept well. She had slept well every night during the 11 weeks she had been building the file. People who had never built a case of this kind imagined it as a period of sleeplessness, of anxiety, of the protagonist staring at ceiling tiles in the dark. This was not her experience. Sleep, she had found, was easy when you knew exactly what you were doing and why. The thing that kept people awake was uncertainty, and she had eliminated uncertainty the way she eliminated discrepancies in a quarterly variance report. Carefully, one entry at a time until the numbers resolved. She resigned on day 29, not at the end of 30 days, not with the separation agreement signed. She resigned with a letter hand-delivered to Marcus's assistant and CC'd to HCM's general counsel, the compliance officer, and the HR director. The letter stated in clear and formal language that she was resigning effective immediately, that she was declining to sign the proposed separation agreement, and that she was doing so on advice of counsel. Also, it did not explain why. It did not need to. She walked out at 11:15 a.m. carrying a single bag that contained her personal items: a coffee mug, 3 books she kept in her desk drawer, her laptop charger, and a framed photograph of her mother taken in Busan in 1987. She had already removed everything else that mattered. The personal device had always gone home with her. There was nothing on her work computer or in her desk that she needed or that she wished to preserve. Derek was standing in the hallway as she walked past. He looked at the bag and then at her face. "Ms. Che," he said, and then he didn't say anything else because there was nothing accurate to add. "You're good at your job, Derek," she said. "Oh, make sure whoever they put in your position knows that the Q2 audit package needs to go out to Greenberg Nacht by the 11th. She walked to the elevator. She pressed the button. She waited. She did not look back. She spent the next 18 days doing something she had not done in 3 years. Nothing. Or what approximated nothing for a person built the way she was. She ran in the morning, 6 miles along the river path, which she had not done since the previous October, and the first 3 mornings her knees complained in a way that she noted and ignored. She cooked actual meals, which required buying actual groceries, which required going to the actual store rather than ordering in from whatever was open on the block below her building. She called her mother twice, which was twice more than she had called in March. She read a novel. Oh, she did not take notes on it. She also, on the 5th day, received a call from an area code she did not recognize. She let it go to voicemail. The message was from an SEC enforcement attorney named James Ford, who stated in the careful, clipped language of someone accustomed to not saying more than necessary that he was calling regarding a tip she had submitted and that he would like to set up a time to speak. She called him back within the hour. James Ford was, it turned out, not particularly warm either. Their first call lasted 22 minutes and covered 4 specific evidentiary questions he had about the timeline and the documentation. He asked about the Whitfield Consultants LLC vendor entry with particular precision, asking her to confirm the date of the contract amount, and the authorization workflow. She confirmed all 3. He asked her to send the relevant documents to a secure upload portal he provided. She had them uploaded within 4 hours. The second call was 8 days later. Ford did not explain what had happened in the intervening 8 days. He asked 2 additional questions: whether she had retained copies of the original vendor invoices from the 4 ghost companies, and whether she had documentation of the disbursement dates. She had both. She uploaded them. She went for her run. On April 18th, the Greenberg Nacht team arrived on site at Hargrove Capital Management. She knew this not because anyone told her, but because she still had a standing coffee meeting with Rita Blum's assistant from the previous year, an arrangement she had made when Rita's team had a question she could answer quickly, and the assistant had texted her to confirm a changed schedule. A small, accidental thread of connection that nobody had thought to sever. She noted the date. She did nothing with it except note it. On April 25th, a Thursday, Martigny called her at 7:42 a.m. "You should probably turn on the news," he said. She turned on the news. The headline on the financial news channel she kept as a background screen in her apartment was not dramatic. It was a crawl at the bottom of the screen. SEC opens investigation into Hargrove Capital Management. The accompanying anchor segment, which ran about 4 minutes, described the investigation in broad terms: a tip to the agency, potential misappropriation of fund assets, investigation ongoing, no names named yet. That was standard procedure. She turned off the television. Then she poured the rest of her coffee into the sink. She had already had 2 cups, and a third would make her hands feel electric. And she went for her run. The thing about the SEC investigation was that it was only one part of what was happening. It was, in some ways, the least immediate part. Naomi had understood from the beginning that an SEC investigation could take months or years to produce visible consequences. She had not filed the tip expecting it to deliver swift, dramatic results. She had filed it because it was the correct thing to do under the regulatory framework, and because establishing her protected status as a whistleblower before doing anything else had been structurally necessary. What she had anticipated, with more precision, was the audit. Greenberg Nacht was on site. Adish Rita Blum's team was looking at the same records Naomi had been looking at for 11 weeks. The difference was that Rita Blum had subpoena power through the audit engagement, and she had the full backing of a firm whose professional reputation depended on the accuracy of its findings. And she had a client, the fund's independent board members, whose fiduciary duty required them to act on what she found. Naomi had called the Greenberg Nacht partner who led the HCM engagement, not Rita Blum, but her superior, a senior partner named Gerald Nacht himself, on April 17th, the day before the team arrived on site. The call had lasted 11 minutes. She had stated clearly and without embellishment that she was a former HCM employee who had filed a whistleblower report with the SEC on a specific date. She provided the confirmation number, and that as part of her own review during her tenure, she had identified specific vendor accounts she believed warranted scrutiny during the audit. She was not telling them what to find. She was telling them where to look. Gerald Nacht had said, in the measured way of a man who had been in the profession long enough to recognize when something important was being handed to him, "I appreciate the call. We'll note your contact in the engagement file." That was all she needed. Now Greenberg Nacht was on site, and Naomi was running 6 miles along the river path, and the air was cool and smelled of wet concrete and early spring mud along the bank. And she was thinking about a line from a contracts law professor she had had in her second year of graduate school. There's also a woman named Professor Adeyemi, who had a habit of looking at the class over the top of her reading glasses when she said something she wanted people to remember. The most powerful position in a legal dispute is not the one making the most noise. It is the one who filed first, documented thoroughly, and then sat down. She had filed first. She had documented thoroughly. She was sitting down. What nobody at Hargrove Capital Management knew, what Marcus had not calculated when he had brought Sloan Whitfield in to replace her, was that the Whitfield Consultants vendor entry, the $85,000 self-authorized advisory contract, was going to be the accelerant. Not because it was the largest fraud involved. It was comparatively small. It was going to be the accelerant because it was new, also because it was undeniable. A person had literally named their own company after themselves and signed themselves a contract. And because Sloan Whitfield's arrival in the role had given the auditors a clean before and after line. Before, 4 ghost vendor accounts totaling $347,000 over 18 months, authorized by Marcus, structured to avoid automated thresholds, a complex, layered scheme that would take months to fully trace. After, 1 transparent self-dealing contract authorized by Sloan in her second week, using her full name, for $85,000 through the same fund disbursement system. Sloan Whitfield had not known about the ghost vendors. That was Naomi's assessment, and she was rarely wrong in her assessments. Sloan had been brought in what capacity exactly was still unclear. Perhaps as a person Marcus trusted, who would look the other way at the existing scheme. Perhaps as someone whose own parallel scheme would serve as a benefit arrangement for a favor Marcus owed her. Perhaps the simplest explanation. Marcus had found someone he could control, who had her own reasons to be motivated by access to capital. And he had let her in the door and handed her administrative access, and trusted that 2 people with their hands in the fund would simply maintain a mutual silence. This was the logic of people who had not been caught before. Naomi had considered, during her 11 weeks of documentation, the possibility that she was wrong, that the ghost vendors were legitimate, and she had simply failed to locate their business presence. That the contracts were above-board consulting arrangements with benign explanations she could not see from her vantage point. She had given this possibility serious, sustained attention. She had been rigorous about it, the way a good forensic accountant is rigorous. She had made the list of alternative explanations, and she had tested each one against the available evidence. And one by one, each alternative had failed to survive contact with the specific facts. Legitimate consulting vendors file corporate tax returns, maintain a business address, issue invoices with itemized work descriptions, and are reachable by phone during business hours. None of the 4 ghost vendors had passed any of these tests. The phone numbers were either disconnected or generic voicemail. As the invoices described services like strategic advisory support and compliance optimization review, without any specificity about scope, deliverables, or time frame. The corporate tax filings, which she had requested through a third-party tax research service that Martin had pointed her to, were either absent or minimal to the point of being structurally suspect. She had been right. She had known she had been right for months. Being right was not interesting to her. It was simply the starting condition, the confirmation that the rest of the work was worth doing. What was interesting, in the dry, precise way that she found things interesting, was watching how the architecture collapsed. The Greenberg Nacht team was on site for 9 days. On the 6th day, Also, the engagement partner requested an emergency call with HCM's independent board members. Naomi did not know this directly. She knew it because Martin Yee had a contact at the firm, a former SEC colleague now in private practice who was consulting on the engagement, who had mentioned it carefully in a way that communicated without constituting a specific disclosure. On the 7th day, the board members called an emergency session. On the 8th day, a corporate attorney Naomi had never met filed for a temporary freeze on 2 of the fund accounts. On the morning of day 9, Sloan Whitfield arrived at the office and found that her access to the fund management system had been revoked. Naomi was told about this by Derek, who texted her at 9:15 a.m. He sent 3 words. "She's locked out." Naomi read the text. She set down her coffee, and she noted the time. Then she sent a reply. "Document everything you see today." Derek sent back a single word. "Already." What happened in the next 48 hours was, by the account of several people Naomi spoke to in subsequent weeks, exactly as unglamorous as the architecture of a financial crime investigation usually is. There was no dramatic confrontation. There was no scene of Sloan Whitfield being escorted out in front of the assembled office. There were quiet conversations behind closed doors, strained phone calls between Marcus and a corporate attorney, the flat, specific language of a compliance breach letter delivered to Sloan's personal email, a demand letter from the fund's independent board seeking return of the $85,000 plus documented processing fees and investigation costs. And then, on the following Monday, exactly 21 days after Sloan Whitfield had sat in that chair in Marcus's office with her rehearsed expression, on day 21 of her tenure as VP of Finance, a formal termination. The wire transferred her out of HCM in 3 weeks. Naomi heard this and thought, less time than I gave the coffee carafe. The SEC investigation, when it became more publicly known 2 weeks later, focused primarily on Marcus and the ghost vendor scheme. This was where the real numbers lived and where the real regulatory consequences would play out. Sloan's self-dealing was folded into the investigation as a secondary line, but the independent board members moved swiftly on their own authority. A demand for clawback of the $85,000, a civil suit for breach of fiduciary duty, and a referral to the state's financial services regulatory body. The referral alone would have licensing implications that would follow Sloan Whitfield in any subsequent financial services employment. It was the kind of mark that did not wash off with a resignation. What happened to Marcus was more complicated and would take longer to resolve, the way large financial crime cases always do. The SEC investigation expanded to cover the full 18-month scope of the ghost vendor scheme. The beneficial ownership disclosure database, which the enforcement team subpoenaed, revealed that 3 of the 4 ghost vendor LLCs shared a common beneficial owner, a trust registered in the name of a family member, 2 steps removed but traceable by someone who knew where to look. The 4th vendor was less cleanly traced, but its payment patterns aligned with a personal account Marcus had used in a prior regulatory matter, a matter from a previous fund, a prior chapter, a history that Naomi had found in a FINRA arbitration database, and added to her documentation without comment. The case would not be over for 2 years, possibly more. Financial crimes cases of this type rarely resolved quickly, but the filing date, the documentation date, the audit trigger date, all of those were fixed. They were in the record. They were timestamps on a story whose outcome she did not need to wait for to know. She had not built the case because she needed to see the ending. She had built it because the building had been the correct response, and because she had been in a position to do it, and because she had been thorough enough to do it well, and because she had learned, in 8 years of looking at numbers, in a career spent in the company of people who thought that complexity was the same thing as invisibility, that there was no such thing as a perfectly concealed number. There was only a number that no one sufficiently motivated had yet looked for. She had been motivated. 3 months after her resignation from HCM, Naomi received an offer from a private equity firm that she had identified during her time at HCM as one of the 3 strategic acquisition targets she had included in the 47-slide presentation she had never been allowed to deliver. The firm was called Strand Capital Partners. She had flagged them in January because their portfolio composition was complementary to HCM's mid-market position. Their management team had 3 years of demonstrated alignment between stated strategy and fund performance, and their compliance infrastructure was, based on public filing data, exactly as strong as the impression given by their governance disclosures. She had done homework on Strand that February. She had looked at them the way she looked at all important things, fully, without shortcuts. The offer was for a managing director of finance position, which sat one tier above VP and carried oversight of the fund's full financial operations and compliance function. The compensation structure included a meaningful carried interest component, not just base and bonus, but participation in fund performance, the kind of alignment she had been asking Marcus to consider for 2 years without getting a direct response. She met with Strand's 2 founding partners for 90 minutes. They asked her, with the directness of people who had done their own research, about what had happened at HCM. She told them exactly what she had done and why. Not with emotion, not with the flourish of someone narrating a grievance. She told them in the language of process, what she had observed, how she had documented it, what regulatory avenues she had used, and what the outcome had been to date. The 2 founding partners looked at each other after she finished speaking. One of them said, "That's exactly the kind of thing we'd want our finance head to do." She signed the offer letter that Friday. There is a detail she had not told anyone. Not Martin Yee, not Derek, but not the founding partners at Strand, that she had kept in the part of her mind reserved for information that had no immediate practical application. On the afternoon of her last day at HCM, the afternoon she had walked out with her single bag and her mother's photograph, she had passed Sloan Whitfield in the hallway. Sloan had been coming from the direction of the 24th floor conference room, the large one with the window that faced the park, where Naomi had run every Q1 board presentation for 3 years. She was carrying a tablet and a notepad, and she was moving quickly with the confident speed of someone who had just come from something and was already going to something else. And when she looked up and saw Naomi with the bag, something crossed her face. Not surprise exactly, not guilt. But it was a more specific expression, the expression of someone who has won something and is in the process of deciding how to wear it. Naomi had looked at her for 1 second. 1 second was enough to read the expression, file it, and move on. She had not thought about it with feeling. She had thought about it the way a forensic accountant thinks about a specific transaction entry when all the surrounding documentation finally comes in. This is the data point that confirms the picture. Sloan had not known what she was walking into. She had seen only what was in front of her. The office, the title, the administrative access, the systems that were now hers to use. She had not seen the audit team that was 4 weeks away from arrival. She had not seen the SEC confirmation number printed on a piece of paper in a fireproof case. Oh, she had not seen the 18 months of documentation organized in 41 clean files. She had not seen the phone call that had already been made to Gerald Nacht. You cannot prepare a defense against a case that has already been built. That was the precision of it. Not the drama of it, not the satisfaction of it. The precision. The fact that every document was dated, every export was time-stamped, every observation was recorded in clean, unambiguous language. Every regulatory step had been taken in the correct sequence. Every protection had been established before the need for protection became visible. The thing had worked not because it was clever, it was not particularly clever, but because it was complete. Naomi was 35 years old. She was starting at Strand Capital Partners the following Monday. Oh, she had negotiated a 3-week onboarding window instead of the standard 2 because she wanted the time to review their existing compliance framework and fund documentation before she had a single meeting with anyone on the finance team. She had already requested the last 3 years of audit reports and the fund allocation schedules for review. She was doing what she always did. She had bought a new Chemex. The old one had developed a hairline crack she only noticed when she held it to the light. And she had purchased a bag of Guatemalan single origin on the way home from Strand. On the Friday she signed the offer letter, because it was the first day of May, and the light over the city at 6 p.m. had that specific quality of late afternoon gold that arrived once a year and lasted for exactly 2 weeks before the summer pushed it higher and flattened it out. And she had decided that the coffee was the right thing to mark the day with. She was precise about what deserved to be marked. She brewed the coffee at the Chemex, which required standing over it with measured patience, The hot water moving in a slow spiral over the grounds, the way she had learned in a YouTube tutorial she had watched 6 years ago and had found, in the watching, unexpectedly calming. The grounds bloomed. The smell was specific. Slightly floral, slightly earthy, and with a dark undertone she associated with high altitude and thin air and somewhere a very long way from the 24th floor of a Manhattan office building. She carried the cup to the table and sat down. She opened her laptop. She deleted the folder called Renovation Notes. Not because she no longer needed it, she had uploaded everything to the SEC portal and kept paper copies in the fireproof case, but because the folder's presence on the personal device had been a functional thing, not a sentimental one, and the function was complete. She did not keep things past their usefulness. She had never been good at that particular kind of attachment. She opened a new document. She titled it Strand Capital, Onboarding Framework. She typed a single heading, Audit Documentation Request, Priority Items. Then she began to list them. Outside her window, the light was still gold. Below, someone was trying to parallel park a large sedan into a space that was slightly too small, and she could hear the light, intermittent honk of a driver somewhere behind it who was impatient. The city was doing what the city always did, demanding, moving, entirely indifferent to whatever had just happened to any specific person inside it. She kept typing. The separation agreement from Hargrove Capital Management was still, technically, unsigned. She had never signed it. The non-compete, the non-disparagement, the 4-month severance, all of it was still sitting in the inbox of her personal email account. She would never sign it. She did not need the 4 months. She did not need the release of claims. She had not done anything that required protection from their claims. And they had done quite enough to warrant liability on their own. Martin Yee had mentioned, on a call 2 weeks prior, that the civil side of the HCM matter, separate from the SEC investigation, would likely generate a class action from fund investors once the investigation findings became public, and that as the individual whose documentation had triggered the investigation, she was potentially eligible for a whistleblower award under Dodd-Frank's incentive program. The program provided financial awards of between 10 and 30% of sanctions collected in cases where the tip led to successful enforcement action with sanctions over $1 million. She had noted this information. She had not told anyone about it. She had not made plans around it or factored it into her current calculations in any specific way. Yes, the award was contingent on too many variables she could not control. The scope of the enforcement action, the final sanction amounts, the timeline, the discretion of the commission. She did not build scenarios around things she could not control. What she had built, and what was now in operation, was the part she could control, the documentation, the filing, the audit trigger, the new position, the new contract, the clean start with all of its original terms negotiated in her favor. She had not been replaced. She had been freed from a system that was already burning, and she had taken the records with her on her way out. And she had handed the records to the people whose job was to respond to them, and she had gone to find the kind of place that was worth working in, while Sloan Whitfield was in the process of discovering what it cost to sign your own name to your own fraud in a system that was already under external audit. Marcus Hargrove was in the process of discovering what happens when 18 months of shell company disbursements meet a forensic accountant with subpoena authority and a documented tip on file. Naomi Che was at her kitchen table with her coffee. She thought about the last line of a note she had made in her plain text file on the morning of January 7th, the morning she had first found the $40,000 discrepancy in the Cortland Infrastructure Feeder Fund. She had written it at the end of the entry after all the specific details, the vendor name, the invoice number, the disbursement date, the discrepancy amount. Almost it was the only line in 41 documents that was not descriptive or analytical. It was a single sentence she had written and then kept over 11 weeks without editing or deleting. She had written, "Find all of it before you do anything." She had found all of it. The document was deleted now, but she remembered the line perfectly, the way she remembered every specific piece of information that had been useful to her precisely without embellishment, in the exact form in which she had first encountered it. She turned back to her screen. Strand Capital, Onboarding Framework. Priority Items. She typed the first entry. Request full vendor contract archive, current fiscal year, and prior 2 years. Authorization workflow documentation for all contracts over $10,000. She typed the second. Review beneficial ownership disclosures for all current vendors against FinCEN database. Confirm compliance with CTA requirements. She typed the third. Request internal signatory authority matrix. Confirm dual authorization policy is operationally enforced, not merely documented. She kept going. There was a fourth item, and a fifth, and the coffee was getting cool. And outside the window, the light was shifting from gold to the pale, slightly gray tone of early evening. And the driver with the too small parking space had either succeeded or given up, because the honking had stopped, and the city had moved on to its next problem, indifferent and relentless, and exactly the same as it had been before any of this happened. She poured the cool coffee into the sink and made a second cup. She stood over the Chemex with the kettle in her hand. She poured in a slow, deliberate spiral. The grounds bloomed. She waited.